Welcome back to SteelCast. After a few months break over the summer, very grateful to Gareth Brooks for filling in my absence. Gareth visited the UK Metals Expo up in the NEC and talked to a whole range of people in the metals industry about the challenges of decarbonisation and what that means, especially for the steel industry. So thanks, Gareth, and if you haven't heard that episode, please tune in and listen in. It's a really good listen. Of course, since we last broadcast a podcast, there's been a significant announcement in the steel industry in the government supporting Tata Steel's investment into decarbonisation and the proposal to start electric arc furnace steelmaking here in Talbot. Probably the most significant investment announcement and technological change, certainly in my career and probably in generations. And there'll be much more to come about that over the coming months and years, and I'm sure that will still be in the news. In spite of that, of course, we're continuing within the steel industry to decarbonise as much as we can, invest in energy saving schemes, and a huge amount of work throughout our UK sites will progress over the coming years whilst we are moving towards decarbonisation. In addition to all of those schemes, we're continuing to welcome people into our business to see what we're doing, to understand our existing processes, to understand the challenges of decarbonisation, and to help us along that way. And in that light, I'm delighted today to welcome in Michael. Michael Lord is Senior Analyst, Industrial Decarbonisation in the Climate Change Committee. Michael, brilliant to welcome you and colleagues into the site today. You had a good look around the site, and we're going to come on to some of that about your impressions of the site. But for those people watching and listening, they will have heard of the Climate Change Committee, but they may not understand its role, its responsibilities, its reporting lines. Tell us a bit about it, will you?
Yeah, sure. The Climate Change Committee was set up by the Climate Change Act in 2008. It's an independent body there to advise the government on climate change, both reducing emissions and adapting to the changing climate. There are committee members who are luminaries, experts in their field, climate scientists, business people, senior politicians who join the committee, and then I actually work for, we usually say we work for the committee, but we work for the secretariat of the committee, so we support the actual committee. And there's a couple of key points where we continually advise government, often in response to them asking us questions, but there's a couple of key points where we advise them. One is we do a progress report to Parliament every year, which is progress on meeting the carbon budgets and the climate targets. And when we do that, we look at the UK economy and we divide it into the main emitting sectors like industry. And we say, well, this is how much we know the government has said it wants to reduce emissions. How is it going? How is it going now? And how is it going in the near future in carbon budget periods? We also help set those carbon budgets and the long-term emissions reduction target. So we advise the government. The carbon budgets are 5 yearly periods that lead to that what's now a net zero target. We advise the government what the carbon budget is, what the target should be. The government then goes away, they can accept that, reject it. So far we've done 6 of them, they've accepted them all, and then they become enshrined in law. So they become legal interim targets on the way to net zero. So that's what we do, and it's a crucial part of it is that we're independent. So we're public servants, we're publicly funded, but we're not civil servants. So we don't have a ministerial overlord, which does give us the ability to say things that perhaps civil servants can't.
And it's quite a holistic view, isn't it? And I know you're here to see the steel industry, and you talked then about emissions from energy-intensive industries such as steel, but it seems like a holistic view, and I got a feeling this is a separate podcast about the costs of carbon and carbon taxes, because they're designed as an incentive, clearly, for people to decarbonise and move down that road, and we'll come on to a bit of that, how that's going down. But they can also act as a penalty to those who are struggling to afford to decarbonise. So do you leave that sort of stuff to the government because it's a policy decision and you kind of take the moral high ground, if you want? Would that be fair?
There are some specific areas where we're asked to comment. The government is kind of required to consult us, and one is the structuring of the ETS. So that's one of the things where when the government changes things like allocations or the overall ETS target, now UK ETS, they will ask us. and we'll give opinions on that. I haven't actually been involved with that myself so far. I should say I've been at the committee for about 9 or 10 months, so relative newcomer. But yeah, we will give our opinion on those sort of things. But it's a fine line that we tread between giving independent advice, but we're not activists. We're not there to criticise the government. We're there to advise them.
But it's quite a responsibility into all the existential crises people talk about. The climate's the big one, isn't it? And I guess a relatively small group with a massive remit, but a huge amount of influence. And you've come here today to put Talbot Steelworks to see the steelworks with some of your colleagues. To better understand it, because it's one thing sitting in an ivory tower in an office, it's another thing, as you've discovered, seeing the steelworks. What have your and your team's impressions been of the visit today? Yeah,
well, I mean, first of all, I mean, whether you might call it an ivory tower, but certainly I'm normally at a desk. I'm trying to understand the industry from a desk. I do talk to people like UK Steel and representatives of other industries, but there's really no replacement for coming to a factory and seeing how it's done, because you can read about how to decarbonise things, and it all looks quite simple on paper in a way, but it's not until you come and see the scale and the complexity of this type of plant. So that's one of the things that's hit me today. And my colleagues as well, the complexity of it. I mean, your colleagues have done a good job of explaining what's happening in each stage, but I'm not sure we've understood 10% of it, because it is incredibly complex.
It is,
there's a lot of interacting machines, and at the end of the day, you've got this very precisely calibrated product, and you're producing huge amounts of it, millions of tons a year. So it's very impressive. So the technical engineering aspects have been impressive, but also the pride in this place, the pride in its history, the pride in what you do every day and your role in the economy has really come through. And the culture of safety and mutual support, that's also struck us, and another thing you can't get by just reading reports.
Yeah, and it is a very impressive place, and for anyone who hasn't been, if you ever get the opportunity, you should come to any industry, I guess. But if we come on to steel and its role in decarbonising society and and reducing the impact on climate change, we have recently announced, as I said in the opening, that our intention is to move from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which will have a significant reduction in carbon emissions. But we've been trying to talk, as we've been trying to persuade the government to support us in this journey, we've tried to talk not just about changing from one technology to another, but the importance of steel throughout the supply chain, especially in the UK around resilience, because every manufacturing supply chain relies on steel. We always say, if it's not made of steel, it's made using steel. So as you in the Climate Change Committee, when you look at industry, is it your position that steel is one of the most important industries to decarbonise, I guess, alongside energy?
Yes, it is. I mean, if you mean by energy, electricity, in a way, that's probably a lot simpler. And we've been doing that for quite some time. That's been decarbonising for decades, really, in this country. And the plan is to have it pretty much decarbonised by 2035, which is only 12 years away. I think steel is one of the harder ones, but there are other hard sectors too, the whole land use area, which I don't know so much about, but there are aspects of that which are quite hard to decarbonise. So yes, we do. When you talk about resilience, the Climate Change Committee's got a remit to consider competitiveness. So when we're thinking about different policies and different ways when you might decarbonise, we're required to take account of competitiveness with other countries. So consider the possibility that measures that might look good will actually lead to the closure of an industry and moving overseas. National resilience and the importance of steel in the economy is probably going a bit beyond our remit. It's not to say it's not important, but it's probably not something we're asked to consider.
Because I guess it's a conversation we have with politicians and political stakeholders to say, it's difficult to imagine a country without steel, given what the country's trying to do, and especially on that journey to a green economy. If you want smart buildings, you want electric vehicles, and you want wind turbines, renewable solar farms and stuff, you kind of need steel, and you have a choice about whether you import it from another country.
That's right.
Whether it's got high or low carbon ambitions or not.
Yeah.
I guess, and again, if you go the other way and you look to this industry potentially moving towards electric arc furnace, which will be scrap-based or used steel-based, pre-loved steel you might call it in the common vernacular, pre-loved steel based, then that's better for the environment because we're not shipping in raw materials from all over the world, but should also be better for the UK resilience. I know you say it's kind of outside your specific remit, but do you get a sense that that is understood within the discussions you're having with government?
To be honest, we don't talk to government about that type of thing. So my main interaction with government is with the Department of Energy and Net Zero.
Yeah.
And so we're generally talking about different policies to decarbonise rather than the role of steel in resilience. Just personally, yes, I think it's steel is absolutely a foundation industry. It is for the normal economy, but especially as we move to net zero, and we'll need so many things, not least thousands of wind turbines that use hundreds of tons of steel each.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting you said about the competitiveness nature of it, because I think it's critically important to the future of the industry. And when we've been talking to government for many years about the cost of energy in the UK and how it puts us as a competitive disadvantage compared to our peers in Europe and so forth. And as we move towards electric arc furnace steel making, then we'll be much more reliant on electricity and, in theory, in green electricity.
Yeah.
Because there's no point in reducing carbon, moving from a blast furnace to an electric arc furnace if you're just going to burn it a coal-fired power station to fire the electric arc furnace.
Yeah.
Now, the government's done quite a lot, the current government's done quite a lot in terms of energy prices and the supercharger policy that gets us on a more competitive playing ground. But it's that balance, isn't it, about saying what's good for the environment and what is good financially. How much do you discuss that interrelationship between energy specifically and energy intensive industries?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely within our ballpark. And when we do a carbon budget, this assessment of how much the UK is going to reduce its emissions and how it's going to do it, we'll be considering what the energy costs are. That will be part of our modelling and part of our modelling for industry. So electrification of industry generally is one of the main pillars for decarbonisation. The other main ones really being carbon capture and storage and hydrogen.
Yeah.
But electrification, a really important one. And so we're aware, we hear from industry, and it's true that the price of electricity is just prohibitive for most, not just steel, but for most industries for switching to electricity. It's just much cheaper to burn something else. It's usually gas, but whatever it is, it's cheaper to burn something. So that's part of in our progress report each year, we give an assessment, and the government itself says, one of the planks of industrial decarbonisation is electrification. And so we kind of rate that as, this year we rated it red, so the worst score, because there's not a plan for it. There are no incentives, which there are for hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And in fact, there are disincentives in the high electricity price, the fact that certain levies are put onto electricity, which they're not onto gas. And we all pay a wholesale cost for electricity driven by the gas market, despite the fact that we've got a significant proportion of renewables and low carbon in the grid now. That's not what sets the price, it's gas. So all of these are problems which lead to a high electricity price, which is a disincentive for what we actually want, which is more electrification.
Yeah, and it does seem like some of these things are some distance away. And we had a previous podcast, John Gibbons from Sheffield University, who spoke very eloquently about passionately about carbon capture, and of course the government's put £20 billion behind behind carbon capture technology for good reason, I'm sure. Hydrogen's another thing that always comes up, but hydrogen seems a long way away. Green hydrogen certainly seems a long way away, and for industries such as ours, you've been to the hot mill today, for example, and we said, look, there's a potential to use hydrogen as a fuel to reheat the slabs in the hot rolling mill. That seems a long way away. How far away is it, do you think, green hydrogen?
Well, as you say, yeah, it's a long way away. I think that I read the other day that the global total in electrolyzers, and I can't remember the number, but it's pretty underwhelming. It's probably, the global total is probably about what you'd need for the hot mill. So green or blue hydrogen being where you use CCS to bury the carbon in natural gas and burn the hydrogen, they're both far away, but at least they're incentivized. And there's a business model that the government's published, and companies can review that business model, and some of them are choosing that path. Not so much here, and I think that's in South Wales, and I think that's partly because there isn't a CCS, a carbon storage repository off the coast here, so it would rely on shipping. So I think it's those clusters that have direct access to CCS where hydrogen is going ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sure it'll develop over time, and when people talk to us about a lot of issues around decarbonising, you go, yeah, but that's the situation today, but tomorrow could be different, and next year could be different, and 5 years could be different. And we've got a few years yet before, if the plans go through with the electric arc furnace, there's a few years before that comes to fruition, and some of those issues may be resolved over that period of time.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing about these three main pillars: CCS, hydrogen, electrification of industrial decarbonisation. My view is that we should electrify where possible, because it's more efficient, and in the long run it will be cheaper and will require less subsidy. There are things where it's just probably too difficult to do it, and therefore we will need CCS and hydrogen, and there are process emissions where just electrifying doesn't cut it, like from cement, so we may need to sequester that carbon. But I think where possible we should electrify, and that's why we're critical of the government for not having a strategy and set of incentives to do it.
And I guess the forward view of that electrification would be from renewable energy primarily.
Yes, that's right.
And I think the UK's done extremely well in terms of offshore wind. And there's lots of potential for floating offshore wind here on the doorstep of Patal. But we get very excited about the discussions with RWE Renewables and their ambitions for floating offshore wind to generate that. And of course solar is another. And again, we've got some great relationships with some of our customers, Solarport, who do these solar farms. So there's great potential for that circular economy, potentially for steel, with the Celtic Freeport potentially here, the Celtic Sea on the doorstep. How excited do you get about that sort of industrial ecosystems developing?
Well, I mean, just to go back to the decarbonisation of the grid, that's obviously should be clear, when we're talking about electrification, it goes hand in hand with that decarbonisation. It's not decarbonising unless you decarbonise the energy source. So while we have built, the offshore wind is a fantastic story for the UK, and we've built, many gigawatts of it now. We need to go a lot further, and the next bit. So I've said, we're aiming to decarbonise the grid. This is the government's aim by 2035, or near net zero by 2035 for the grid. That's going to be harder than what we've done so far, because we're getting into the territory of where the intermittency, the natural intermittency of wind, it will be mostly wind, but also of solar, needs to be managed. So we need some kind of strategy to do that. And that's another area where we've recommended to the government that we need an overall strategy of how we do this difficult bit. It can be done, but it is tricky. We're one of the leaders in doing this, and so we need to work out how to get there. What we think is that solar and wind will provide our energy directly without balancing about 70% of the time.
Wow.
The other 30% we need, where we're going to have nuclear, and then we're going to have things that are very flexible, that fill in those gaps, basically. So that'll be things like hydrogen generation, gas generators with CCS, and maybe a very small amount of gas without CCS.
I was going to say, these things go around, don't they? And nuclear clearly has a part to play in it, and I guess I was growing up in the 70s, showing my age now, but when nuclear was deemed a terrible thing, and all of a sudden people were saying, but now it's a great thing because it's carbon free. And I guess the other aspect of that we've not touched on, and not for today, is the challenge of storing energy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that one of the world's greatest challenges?
I think it is that this is partly what I'm talking about, developing this system where you're able to rely on intermittent sources of energy. So in most countries around the world, I mean, there are a few that have got lots of hydro or geothermal, but mostly it's going to be solar and wind that produce our renewable electricity. They're obviously intermittent. You know, solar's very intermittent,
especially in Wales.
Especially in Wales, especially in the UK. So we need to store energy. I think we know what the answer for short-term energy storage is, and a lot of that is going to be batteries. But batteries don't get you through 2 weeks of winter when the wind's not blowing. No. So we need to store it. So that's why we'll probably still need gas for some time, biomass as well, hopefully with CCS. So that could be a carbon negative technology, and stored hydrogen. Yeah.
Now, as we talk through all of these different technologies, the one thing that is becoming maybe more apparent to the general public is the cost of going green, financially and in terms of jobs potentially, on a positive and negative basis. But the cost of going green is starting to, it feels like it's starting to get politicians and the public to start pushing back, and we've seen Rishi Sunak say, we're just going to slow it down. We're still going to go 2050, but we're going to slow it down because this cannot impact on people's lives. And government governs with the permission of society. And do you have any sympathy for society pushing back on the speed of change?
Yeah, of course. And we've got a big team now internally called the People and Business Team, and one of the things they're assessing is how we make this transition fair. You know, it has to be fair. We know it can be done technically. We've got the solutions to do it, and we know that it's pretty affordable overall. So I think I can't tell you the exact figures, but in the 6th carbon budget, the last one that we did, I think we said that most of the cost of it is offset by what we save on using less fossil fuels. So we'll switch to electric vehicles. There'll be a cost to that, but eventually we won't be buying any petrol to run our cars, so that there's a saving on the other side. So the actual cost in any single year, I don't think rises above 1% of GDP. So we think it's affordable. And there'll be many benefits to the country, and things like clean air, for example, greater energy security. But that's not to say there won't be individuals, if we don't do this right, for whom there are costs on them, either in terms of having to pay for something, or they lose their job because industry is going to change. There'll be fewer petrol stations, for example. So that's part of government's job, as we see it, to make that fair, and to be aware of these issues and have a plan for them.
And would you say part of that is the inevitability that when you introduce new things, they're always more expensive? You've got to pay for the research. There's fewer of them. So, things like electric vehicles, really expensive. Heat pumps, really expensive. People can't afford them. They can't go green. So they're saying, why do I need to be poorer to have the same outcome? But I guess over a period of time, if I go back to when I was young and a computer would have cost me £3,000 in 1980, and it now costs me £300 40 years later. So, because of the mass production and so forth, is that what's going to happen with green technologies? Is it going to become bigger and wider and therefore cheaper, do you think?
I think for many of them it will, and we've seen that with solar and wind. I think if you go back to the 70s, if you go back far enough, back to when you said you were growing up, I think solar was something like 100 times more expensive than today. So it was used on space shuttles and a few very niche uses, but you wouldn't have it on your house. 100 times more expensive. Even if you go back 10 or 12 years, it was 10 times more expensive. So even then, it's not economic for running a grid. At the price it is now, solar's in many countries is the cheapest form of generating electricity, which is an incredible transformation. In this country, the cheapest form is onshore wind, which has seen not quite as dramatic as solar, but very dramatic.
But no one wants a wind turbine on their back doorstep.
Well, there's that issue. So I think electric vehicles, the main cost is the batteries, and that's why they've been more expensive. But they're expected sometime this decade. I think you can see different projections to be cheaper to buy, and they're already a lot cheaper to run.
Yeah.
So once they're cheaper to buy, I think there'll be a good news story. And no one, people buy them now, but no one's forced to.
Yeah.
But by the time, you can't buy a petrol car, I think we're pretty confident that it will be cheaper anyway to buy an electric car.
Yeah.
And the same with heat pumps. I mean, heat pump, we're seeing some deals now come onto the market. I think OVO and Octopus and British Gas, with the government grant, they're offering heat pumps around the same ballpark as a gas boiler.
Yeah.
I think I've even seen ones that are cheaper, and that's already. So by the end of the decade, I think you could expect they're going to be cheaper and better.
I guess that's what we're all hoping for as well, isn't it? Now, if I could just turn on to a point where, you're at the UK Climate Change Committee, I guess.
Yeah.
Climate change is a global issue.
Yeah.
When I mentioned John Gibbons before at Sheffield University, he was very much the opinion that because Britain's a relatively small country, the effect it can have on climate change is actually very small globally.
Yeah.
He was saying our responsibility as a developed nation should be to invest in technologies that are demonstrable that other countries can pick up, rather than just looking after our own little island and saying, well, we're doing our bit.
Yeah.
How can we take the lead and have a demonstrable technology that others can lead?
Yeah.
Is that something that's within the remit of Climate Change Committee, or are you just saying, listen, it's UK government, UK society, we're going to worry about the UK?
No, we're very aware about our role as climate leaders. Successive governments have pitched the UK as climate leaders, and there's some justification behind that. And it's not just about. I agree with your previous guest's point about technology, but I don't think it's just about technology. So one of the ways we've been a climate leader is to set ambitious targets and to legislate those. So I'm not sure if we were the first country in the world to legislate a climate target, but we were one of the first, and one of the first to make that a net zero target, because originally that was a 80% reduction by 2050. We've also led the world in contracts for difference, so the business model that has led to the offshore wind revolution, which has also made us a leader in offshore wind. So I agree, the UK's got a role there, and it has played that role in many ways, and it's important we don't lose that, because those models, so the Climate Change Committee model, for example, is copied by many other countries now. Contracts for difference are copied by many other countries. Other countries have followed with legislating net zero targets, and we'd very much like to see us continue.
It's a real difficult challenge, and I don't know anyone knows the right answer. I have some sympathy with John's perspective about saying we can be a thought leader in technologies, but then, should you hold back your own ambitions and all that? It's a real difficult one, isn't it?
I would say Britain can't lead on everything. It is a big world. We're a tiny part of GDP. So, let's say battery technology or solar panels, maybe that's for other countries to lead on. But Britain can choose certain things, technologies, business models, policies, and lead on them. Yeah.
And going back to a point I was talking about earlier about, where the pressure comes on to decarbonise. So in the steel industry, let's talk about the steel industry. So legislators say, this is the right thing to do for society, for the UK, for the world. This is the right thing to do. We're going to start introducing legislation to incentivise companies to move towards a lower carbon solution. And whether it's due to that or public awareness or public pressure, society also says it's important to improve our environmental credentials and reduce the impact on the environment and the climate. Do you think that, at least for the short term, that these green solutions, if we can call them that, provide private companies such as Tata Steel with a competitive advantage?
I mean, it'd be interesting to get your perspective on that, Tim. What I would say is it should do, because before this job I was a consultant, and one of the things I used to do is work with companies to develop their climate targets and set net zero strategy, often under the auspices of something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
Yeah, we know that, yeah.
So just under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, I think there's something like 6, I looked it up on the way, so I was surprised, it's gone up a lot since I last looked. There are 6,000 companies with targets under that initiative, and there are many more that under other initiatives, or they've just announced it in annual reports. When they make those when they set those targets, they're including everything in their supply chain. So every company, construction company, automotive, machinery company that buys steel is essentially saying that they will be buying zero or very low carbon steel in the future. So there is a huge potential demand there. But it'd be interesting to know from you, if I could turn it around, if you're seeing that. Because what I saw as a consultant is these companies setting these targets are not necessarily making it clear to their supply chain that they've effectively set a target for them. And I think a company as sophisticated and large as Tata knows that that's going on. But for a smaller manufacturer, they may not be aware of this.
So I think if you asked our marketing director, Russell Codling, he would say absolutely there's an advantage. He would say our customers are crying out for green steel. Now, whether that's a result of the legislation that is being imposed on them or consumer demand for their products might not be quite clear. But they are certainly looking at the steel industry to supply them with greener products. And I guess certainly within Europe, I can't imagine a place where some companies are providing a net zero steel and some people are providing a non-net zero steel for a cheaper amount, less amount of money and being competitive. I just don't think our customers are in that place. So I do think there's a competitive advantage in the short term. I think it won't be long before it becomes an entry-level requirement. And if you're not making green steel or net zero steel, I don't think you'll be in the game, certainly in Europe. But there's a big old world out there. And Pete Quinn, who's been with us today, our sustainability director, keeps reminding me that by 2050, 50% of the world's steel will still be made using virgin materials through blast furnaces. And it's a globally competitive market. So maybe there's an advantage for some time to go. But listen, Michael, I'm very conscious. You've been with us all day, and it's been a pleasure to have you and your colleagues here and show you around the works. But I'm conscious it's now starting to get dark, and you've got a home to go to like the rest of us. But I did want to just pick up on one sort of final thing, which is about the role of governments and how they're incentivising companies to move to green technologies. And we talked before about, carbon costs are designed to be an incentive, but actually can be a disincentive because it means you haven't got enough capital. You can't make enough capital to spend on new schemes, which is a difficult thing. But do you think they are doing enough to incentivise companies to move to green technologies? And if not, what are the things that they should be doing to support industries, energy-intensive industries such as steel, to decarbonise?
This is where we run into the fact that I've only been at the committee for 10 months, and I'm always a bit uncertain as to what we can say about government policy. But you said governments, so it's clear that around the world, governments are not doing enough to meet the targets that they themselves have set, which is to limit warming to well below 2 degrees at minimum and to strive to 1.5. So I think that's safe to say. When it comes to our government, there's a good track record in reducing emissions. We've got good targets, but as our last progress report said, when we look to the medium term, so what we call carbon budgets 5 and 6, which takes us to 2032, and then carbon budget 6 is 2037. We're not doing enough to continue on the trajectory that we need to be on to reach net zero and to hit the interim targets on the way to net zero, which are just as important. So overall, some things are good, but it's not enough. And that's a comment globally. One of the good things that's happened in the last few years is the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is a huge amount of federal money to back things like clean energy, hydrogen, industrial decarbonisation, and it's really many billions. I think in some senses it's trillions, uncapped, and all sorts of tax incentives, which is seen as stimulating a huge amount of the private sector investment that's needed. So the second part of your question was what can government do to stimulate that? Well, that's one thing that's clearly working. I think having clear strategies and the CEO of Ford said something recently about there are three things that business needs, something like confidence, ambition, certainty, something like that. So once you've set the net zero target, then don't waver from the target. Policies may change along the way, but don't leave any doubt that that's the trajectory that we're going on. In the terms of incentivizing industry, I think government procurement is something that can play a role. So before we were talking about the demand from businesses, but I don't know what proportion of steel government effectively buys through government-funded projects, but it's quite a large proportion, isn't
massive
it,
client,
in this country. So they could take the lead in setting targets for how steel should decarbonise and being the purchaser of that steel and being willing to perhaps to pay a bit more for it. So I think that's one thing that they could do.
Yeah, and I think the UK Steel Charter is targeting exactly that, whether it's the government or local authorities, who, after all, are the people who build, railways and roads and schools and hospitals and stuff, which are all steel intensive, to say, how can you commit to using UK-made steel, and within that, incentivising the UK steel industry to decarbonise, which they put their hand in their pocket and they're helping us on that road. So I suppose,
indeed,
we're on the road, and it's just interesting to get your perspectives about where that might go next.
Yeah, so. And you mentioned the carbon price, and I think the carbon price does penalise carbon emissions. So in principle, it's a good thing. But we're very aware. As I said, we're asked. Part of our remit is to consider competitiveness. If you're paying a carbon price in this country, but you can still import steel from countries where it's not paid, that doesn't really make sense. So we're glad that the government is considering a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and we think that makes sense. Yeah.
Listen, time's run out, I'm afraid, Michael. It's been a pleasure to have you guys here today, and I'm delighted that Climate Change Committee have kind of seen the steel industry firsthand, seen it how it is today, seen our processes, understand how they work, and talk to some of the people in our business about the challenges that we've got going forward and our aspirations. Henrik Adam, our CEO, chairman, always says, look, we've got the skills, we've got the ambition, we've got the knowledge. We just need to get over that hill about getting some commitment from the government in terms of policy and in terms of capital expenditure. And I guess, with a 5-term parliament, it's quite difficult to say, well, we know the policies for today, but we don't know what they're going to be in 5 years' time, and whether future governments will back it further or impose further green levies will be challenges that we have to come up against. But hopefully you are now, as a group, sort of friends and defenders of the steel industry, and you will have certainly a more emotional and better informed understanding of our challenges here. But listen, great to see you today. And
it's been fascinating. Thank you, Tim.
You're very welcome.
Thanks.
So listen, I hope you're enjoying this series of SteelCast, which is focusing on decarbonisation. We're trying to talk to as many people as we can inside the business and outside the business. Great to hear today from Michael from the Climate Change Committee about what they're doing in terms of influencing and working with government, and the role of energy-intensive industries such as steel in reducing the impact of society on the climate. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you haven't subscribed already, please do, and then you'll get the latest episode straight to your phone or your device. We're featuring on Podbean, on Google, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. So if you haven't subscribed, please do so. If you want to leave a comment, please do that as well. And if you think there's other people we should speak to, or other topics you would like us to address, then let us know, and we'll see what we can do along the way. But thanks for joining today's podcast, and see you soon.